Hello, good afternoon. This is the Al24 News. I'm Rahim Kashur. To the headlines. Bulgaria bus crash resulted in 45 killed after vehicle catches fire on a motorway. In Venezuela, the Socialist Party candidates winning in 20 of 23 governance races. Twelve Sudanese ministers resign in protest of deal with the military. Hello again and welcome. A bus carrying 52 people traveling from Sofia, the capital of Bulgaria, to Blagoevgrad in the country's southwest on the bus crash and caught fire, which caused the death of 45 people. Children were among the victims. 7 people with burns and wounds were taken to Birgov Hospital in Sofia. The accident has occurred in the Strama highway near the village of Bushnak. Most of the victims were from the country. According to officials, 7 people who had been in the crash were being treated and they are in a stable state. A ferry capsize of the coast of eastern Sri Lanka resulted in death of at least 6 people, including 4 children. The ferry was traveling from Kurwanishki to the town of Kinaya along Sri Lanka's eastern coast at the time of the accident. Zara Farjani on what's follow.
At least 6 people have been killed in a ferry capsized in eastern Sri Lanka on Tuesday. 12 people more have been rescued and the search for others is continuing. A Navy spokesman said it wasn't immediately clear how many people were on board the ferry or what caused it to overturn. 4 children were among the dead, according to a policeman and a hospital worker who spoke on condition of anonymity because they weren't authorized to talk to the media. The ferry was traveling from Korinchakini to the town of Kinia along the country's eastern coast and about 260 kilometers northeast of the capital, Colombo. It was carrying mostly students and teachers to a school across a lagoon when it capsized. Ferry accidents are relatively rare in Sri Lanka because many locations are now connected by bridges. However, the bridge that connects the 2 towns has been closed for repairs, forcing people to use basic vessels to cross the river. Angry residents burned tires and surrounded government offices, blaming officials for the accident. Pictures show police and members of the Navy at the scene, with crowds of people standing on the shoreline.
Yet in Sri Lanka has started the first 3 trials related to the suicide bombing in 2019 that resulted in the death of nearly 270 people. The suspects were brought under heavy guards from different prisons by the police to the Colombo High Court. During this morning, the police filed charges against 23,000 suspects, including conspiracy in the murder, aiding and abetting the attack, and collecting arms and ammunition. The group also includes Mohammed Nawafar, who officially says mastermind the attack is linked to Islamic State. Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed announced he's joining the front today to lead the armed forces against the rebel of Tigray Liberation Front at a time when the battles are getting closer and closer to the capital, Addis Ababa. The living conditions of the population deteriorate due to the lack of material assistance. Zara Farjani again.
The Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed joins his soldiers who are fighting the rebels and overthrowing the regional authorities deriving from the Tigray People's Liberation Front, after he accused the regional forces of attacking army posts at a time when the battles are getting closer and closer to Addis Ababa. Ethiopian media suggested that the city of Debre Barhan, about 130 kilometers from the capital, would fall in front of the Tigray Liberation Front forces in the coming hours, while the authorities said that the rebels' military advances and imminent threat to Addis Ababa were exaggerated. The number of allied groups against the government forces reached 9, all aimed at stopping Abiy Ahmed, who called on the residents of Addis Ababa to organize their ranks and prepare to defend their city, in light of growing fears of the progress of the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front fighters and their allies towards the capital. The US envoy to the Horn of Africa and his African counterpart, former Nigerian president, are making unremitting efforts in an attempt to reach a ceasefire, stopping the war that killed thousands and displaced more than 2 million people. The US military has positioned US Special Operations Forces in Djibouti to be ready to provide assistance to the US Embassy in Ethiopia if the situation worsens, according to one military official and two sources familiar with the movements.
As many as 12 cabinet ministers resigned from Sudanese Prime Minister Abdullah Hamdok on Monday as an objection to the political deal between the premier and the head of Sudanese ruling military council Abdel Fattah al-Burhan. This reinstatement between army and political leader was done to put an end to the weeks of long crisis that jeopardizes Sudanese political transition. Let's follow this report.
Hamdok was reinstated on Sunday after signing a political accord with Sudan's ruling military council's president, Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, to put an end to weeks-long crisis that jeopardized Sudan's political transition. According to a statement, the resigned ministers include those in charge of foreign affairs, justice, agriculture, irrigation, investment, and energy. Ministers of higher education, labor, transportation, health, youth, and religious affairs all resigned. The 5 ministers from the Forces of Freedom and Change coalition, which had shared power with the military right before the military takeover last month, were unable to attend Monday's cabinet meeting. The ministers did not give a clarification for their resignation. They were part of a Hamdok-led transitional administration that was dissolved by al-Burhan on October 25th. In the face of opposing protests and charges from the military and lawmakers, al-Burhan imposed a state of emergency and sacked the transitional administration. Many have been killed since the October 25th military takeover in the middle of protests calling for a civil government.
Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro congratulated the United Socialist Party for winning the post of regional president in 20 states beside the capital Caracas in the local elections that took place in Venezuela on Sunday. Hassan Berkan on What's Follow.
The camp of President Nicolás Maduro scored a landslide victory in the local elections on Sunday, according to what the National Electoral Council announced. Shortly after the first results were published, President Nicolás Maduro celebrated the triumph.
As a result of the efforts of the 24 federal regions of our country and the great national poll, the revolutionary forces won 21 positions, including in the capital of Venezuela, Caracas, and this is 21 out of 24 regions, which is the result of hard work, a result that sheds light on the truth.
The power camp won 20 out of 23 governorships and the mayor of Caracas in the face of the divided opposition that participated for the first time in a vote since 2017, after it had previously boycotted the presidential and legislative elections. Information from the Venezuelan National Electoral Council announced these results after 90% of the votes were counted, while the participation rate in the election was 41%. As for the Venezuelan opposition, it won according to the preliminary results the local elections in 3 states, expressing reservation and considering that the late closing of polling stations may have led to fraud. These elections constitute a victory for the Venezuelan regime, which is seeking to lift sanctions imposed on it after the re-election of Nicolás Maduro as president of Venezuela in 2018, which was not recognized by part of the international community.
In the same line of thought, Venezuela's National Electoral Council awarded victory to the governing Socialist Party in 18 governorship. In a report following local and regional elections on Monday, President Nicolás Maduro celebrated the government's victory shortly after the initial results were released as far as the Venezuelan opposition that participated for the first time in votes since 2017, after it had previously boycotted the presidential and legislative elections. It won the local elections in 3 states, expressing reservation and considering that the late closing of polling stations may have led to fraud. In Europe, Belarusian government announced the repatriation of 118 Middle Eastern nationals and more is to be sent on Tuesday. However, difficulty in communication in the barrier between the EU leader and Belarusian Foreign Affairs Ministry why migrants are still living savage on the border. Ayadi Usamon was followed.
Belarusian Interior Ministry announced the repatriation of 118 Middle Eastern migrants from its territories, and more will be sent to the motherlands on Tuesday. In parallel with this last declaration of officials in Belarus, the European Union accused the latter of bringing thousands of migrants in and pushing them in the bloc to break through Europe via Lithuanian and Latvian borders. Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko stated that the EU refused to discuss the fate of 2,000 migrants and didn't show any help for the stuck Middle Eastern nationals. And European leaders refused any contact despite calls from Belarusian Foreign Minister. According to German government spokesman Stefan Seibert, the possibility of a humanitarian corridor to Germany for 2,000 migrants is not acceptable neither for Germany nor for the EU. And he added that Lukashenko engineered this international crisis as a revenge for the sanctions imposed by the European Union after the brutal suppression of Lukashenko's regime on protests against his rule. Migrants say they want to access European territories through Polish borders, and Lukashenko stated that his government is ready to do that even if he has to devote airplanes for the process. However, it is more complicated for the European Union as the latter insists on not giving permissions for the migrants to access their territories.
AstraZeneca will see COVID jab profits starting from next year. The company defends its decision to start making profits from its COVID-19 vaccine, saying that the countries with low purchasing power will be spared. Nabil on what follows.
AstraZeneca announced it would move from previous commitments to sell the shots of a non-for-profit basis during the pandemic to modest profitability for sales of its COVID-19 vaccine. More than 1 billion doses of the jab have so far been released around the world by AstraZeneca and its partners, but until now they have been sold at cost, giving the vaccine a price tag of around $4 per shot. The Anglo-Swiss pharmaceutical company had said its COVID-19 vaccine contributed $275 million but cut little of its earnings. That will result in the company seeking to achieve a modest profit in the future from the vaccine in order to fund its new antiviral COVID treatment. The company's decision to begin seeking profit from its COVID vaccine is unlikely to begin until next year, as it still had many doses of the vaccine to supply that it had promised to do so at cost. The move from AstraZeneca comes amid poor countries are struggling to provide anti-corona jabs for their citizens. However, AstraZeneca said the jab, which it developed alongside the University of Oxford, will still be supplied to poorer nations on a not-for-profit basis, and profits will be used to substitute costs from its COVID antibody treatment.
Austria has returned to a full national lockdown as protests against new restrictions aimed at curbing COVID-19 infections spread across Europe. From midnight, Austrians have been asked to work from home and non-essential shops have closed. Ayadu Salman was followed.
Austrian government succeeded relatively to reconfine its population in a desperate try to decrease the spiraling number of COVID-19 cases in the country. This action took place starting from Monday, as citizens are under the obligation of staying home with severe restrictions by the forces, which doesn't permit the people to go out except for necessary activities, including shopping for groceries or going to the doctor. This lockdown was imposed as the average number of deaths is hiking, and hospitals warned that their intensive care units are reaching capacity. The quarantine will last 10 days, with the possibility of extension that can reach 20 days. Austrian Chancellor Alexander Schallenberg announced last week that there would be a mandate for vaccination. However, he didn't give any further explanation on how the mandate will work. But the government stated that the citizens who do not abide by the vaccination rules would face fines. The rate of infections in Austria is rising very rapidly, and vaccination rates are insufficient for the Western European nation to hold off the winter wave. However, the country witnessed fierce protest in the city of Vienna in refusal of the vaccination on Saturday.
The current 7-day average of COVID-19 cases in the United States rose 18% from last week's average to 92,800 per day, according to U.S. Centers for Disease Control. However, the United States is not willing to impose a lockdown or shut down its economy to curb the spread of COVID-19. Yet, It is going to rely on the other tools, White House COVID-19 response coordinator Jeff Zients said on Monday. U.S. regulators expanded eligibility for boosters shot of COVID-19 vaccines to all adults on Friday, and 3 million people received them since the statement. Countries in Africa remain far behind in the vaccination process, as most African countries still rely on supplies from overseas, despite efforts to take initiatives to produce jobs locally. Nabil on What Follow.
As countries around the world hit COVID vaccine milestones, many African nations remain worryingly behind in their initial plans to provide jabs for their citizens. Africa has so far largely relied on supplies from overseas, as most of the vaccines that have reached the continent have come via Vaccines Global Access Initiative, or also known as COVAX Initiative, or through donations. African countries have now a production line with the capacity to produce 50 million COVID vaccine doses per year, a goal set to develop vaccines with African Union member states and secure sustainable vaccine production capacities, a step that will also improve overall medical care in Africa. Moderna, for instance, has confirmed that Rwanda, Senegal, and South Africa could all be potential sites for the planned vaccine factory in Africa. It is true that there is a huge shortage of doses in Africa. The biggest challenge remains actually in vaccinating people. As a result, thousands of vaccine doses have been destroyed in African countries because they have exceeded their expiry dates. Others are being returned by countries saying they will be unable to use them. Countries like Malawi destroyed almost 20,000 doses, and South Sudan announced it would destroy around 60,000 doses. The reason is that many countries failed to prepare adequately before receiving the vaccines. Africa is in a very tough spot when it comes to supply, and many factors are leading to delays, including a lack of funds and trained professionals, and hesitancy among the population to get the vaccine. All are holding back the rollout.
A driver fleeing from a domestic disturbance killed 5 people and injured more than 40, including 2 children in Waukesha, Wisconsin, yesterday, Monday. Police said that the driver would be charged with 5 counts of intentional homicide. Hussam again.
A tragedy in Waukesha, Wisconsin, after at least 5 people were killed and more than 40 were injured, including 2 children, when a car crashed in a parade. Police Chief Don Thompson said that Dara Brooks Jr., 39, was fleeing a domestic disturbance with a report of a knife when he crashed into the parade. Brooks was not being chased. Thompson said that the driver will be charged with 5 counts of intentional homicides.
Through barricades into a crowd of people that was celebrating the Waukesha Christmas parade, which resulted in killing 5 individuals and injuring 48 additional individuals. I just received information that 2 of the 48 are children and they're in critical condition. We have information that the suspect prior to the incident was involved in a domestic disturbance, which was just minutes prior, and the suspect left that scene just prior to our arrival. The suspect involved in this tragic incident is identified as Daryl E. Brooks, male, 39 years of age, who is a resident of the city of Milwaukee. At this time, the Waukesha Police Department is referring 5 counts of first-degree intentional homicide with additional charges based on the investigation, but those will come in time.
Social media footage showed the vehicle breaking through barriers and speeding into the road where the parade was taking place. Shocked by the incident, people, including families and children, fled for their lives as the car sped off, knocking down dozens of people.
U.S. President Joe Biden nominated Jerome Powell as chairman of the U.S. Federal Reserve for a second term. Jerome Powell was initially appointed by former President Donald Trump in 2018 and now is set to stay in the role for another 4 years. Powell's management of the economy during the pandemic gained lots of praise. However, he was criticized for not doing enough to tackle climate change and poverty and said he was weakened regulation of financial institutions. Former South Korean President Choi Dong-hwan, remembered as a dictator whose path to power was paved by presidential assassination and military coup, died at the age of 90. Marwa Bel'iwar on this report.
At the age of 90, Chun Doo-hwan, the former South Korean military strongman who took power in a 1979 coup and brutally suppressed pro-democracy protests before being imprisoned for misdeeds in office, passed away. After years of authoritarian rule, Chun Doo-hwan permitted some liberalization. Under public pressure, he agreed to the nation's first direct and free election in history after hundreds of pro-democracy protesters were killed and tens of thousands were imprisoned during his presidency in the 1980s. During Chun's presidency, South Korea's economy grew rapidly. The country also hosted the 1986 Asian Games and was awarded the rights to host the 1988 Summer Olympics, which began after he left office. Chun implemented a range of liberalizing measures, including the repeal of a curfew imposed during the Korean War and the relaxation of regulations on trips abroad. He reportedly dropped plans to develop atomic bombs and longer-range missiles in an attempt to gain Washington's support for his military-backed government. On the other hand, during Chun's reign, North Korea repeatedly challenged South Korea. During a visit to Myanmar in 1983, North Korean commandos launched a bomb attack on Chun. He narrowly avoided being injured in the attack, which killed 21 people, including several South Korean government ministers. Since resigning in 1988, Chun sought asylum in a Buddhist temple for 2 years before being arrested. He was found guilty of corruption, rebellion, and treason and condemned to death. Yet he was pardoned in 1997 in a bid for national reconciliation. Before his release, the court ordered him to pay back $119 million he had amassed in a slush fund during his rule. According to emergency officials and police who were dispatched to his Seoul home, Chun died at his home due to a cardiac arrest.
A summarized paper of the international news with Islam Seed.
Police operation, at least 8 dead were discovered on the outskirts of Rio de Janeiro. Following a gun battle with police, bodies were discovered in mangrove swamp outside of the city. In Brazil, with several showing signs of torture, the bodies were all tossed into the mangrove swamp, according to witnesses who declined to be identified. They threw one after the other. All the indicators point to slaughter here. At least 12 people were killed by armed rebels in an attack on displaced civilians in the Democratic Republic of Congo's northeastern Ituri on Sunday night, when fighters from the Cooperative for the Development of the Congo group raided the village of Drodo, killing 6 children, 4 men and 2 women. Coreco spokesman Patrick Bassa, on the other side, denied the group had slain civilians and stated that the fighters had engaged with the Hema militia near Drodo, but that the people had already departed the region. NASA is preparing to launch spacecraft to see if it can redirect a double asteroid redirection test mission, which is set to launch on Tuesday, and attempts to deflect an asteroid away from a possibly catastrophic impact with Earth. Although the asteroid poses no harm to the globe, scientists such as Stephen Hawking have classified impact events as one of the humanity's greatest hazards. In SpaceX's facility at the Vandenberg Space Force Base in California, the spacecraft is joined to its payload adapter before taking off. It will be launched on the top of a Falcon 9 rocket. Unprecedented rains and floods led Bengaluru state to raise concern as lakes and tanks overflowed in the city to transform the city into streams. Emergency services in the area urged tractors and boats to be in action for the service of the city. These unseasonal rains of 2 weeks in the South Karnataka city left 24 deaths, according to state disaster authorities official, in addition to transforming the city to a lake-like area.
Ending up with Paul Lebron James has been suspended for 1 game and Detroit's Isaiah Stewart banned for 2 for their roles in an ugly confrontation during Sunday's Lakers Pistons game. The incidents occurred in the third quarter when James and Stewart were jostling for position during a free throw. His arms appeared to become intertwined and James swung his elbow, making contact with Stewart. Let's follow.
Giannis and then Jason Tatum.
Anger is always bad. To this end, ladies and gentlemen, let's have a reminder of our main stories. Bulgaria has crash resulted in 45 killed after vehicle catches fire on motorway. In Venezuela, the Socialist Party candidates winning in 20 of 23 governance races. Sudanese ministers resign in protest of a deal with the military. That's all what we have got for you now. Stay tuned for our 6 p.m. edition. Peace.